Julian Agyeman is a professor of urban and environmental planning at Tufts University and a fellow at the Royal Society of the Arts and the Royal Geographic Society. He is the originator of the concept of just sustainabilities, the integration of social justice and sustainability. Tonight is all about transformational change that we know we need to make together. I bet he has a few ideas to help us get there. So please welcome Julian Agyeman up to the stage.
Well, thank you, Seattle. Thank you, Washington Environment Council. And yes, I really do speak like this. So we are in this together. I've spent a day in Seattle. I was having lunch with the environmental professionals of color. What a great organization. What an excellent organization. I can see that a lot of good work is going on in the Puget Sound area. So the theme of what I want to talk about then is we're in this together. But I want to start with an appreciation. I've recently been in Australia. And actually this year I'm in Montreal on sabbatical. It's one of the great things about being an academic. We are given time to think about things that we want to think about. And actually, we don't have the slide that I'm seeing here, so can we get the slide, guys? Thank you. So that's why I'm saying we're in this together. One of the things that the Australians and the Canadians do before any event like this is usually have a welcome to the land by an elder of the local tribes. And so I did a bit of research, and we are on the land of the Duwamish people. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and future, and we commit to a principle of respect and care for country as part of this meeting. And I've made a pledge that every single talk that I give now, I will find out who the elders are, who the tribal people are, and I'll pay respect in line with tribal recognition and reconciliation. And I want to play you a short 2-minute video by the Canadian Indigenous Placemaking Council, because it talks about a theme that I want to develop in my next 15 minutes or so, and that's the theme of belonging. Because we can only talk about becoming future cities, future Washington State, if we recognize who belongs. And many people, as I'll talk about, do not belong.
What does belonging look like if nothing of your culture, history, language, or art is visible in the streets, parks, buildings where you live? How can you ever feel welcome there? The Indigenous Placemaking Council seeks to restore Indigenous presence to Canadian cities, towns, and communities.
So I want to start with this. I want to start with this idea of belonging. And as an urban planner, as a person who works on urban and environmental policies and planning, what I've realized is belonging is of fundamental importance. And one of my favorite quotes about what urban planning is, and you could think about this as placemaking as well, is it's about managing our coexistence in shared space. Two very important words, coexistence and sharing. Coexistence and sharing. That's what we are doing. That's what we are doing. When the governor talks about protecting orcas, he's making a pledge for coexistence and for sharing a future with these amazing and wonderful species. But what I want to suggest, though, is it's a little more complex than just saying coexistence and sharing. Whether it's environmental, transport, housing, or any other kind of environmental conflict, we share this space, we coexist with people who don't look like us, who don't talk like us necessarily, who don't worship like us, who don't think necessarily like us or eat like us. How do we, as environmental professionals, urban planners, how do we coexist in shared space with people with very different ideas about those spaces? So that's one of the challenges of belonging. It's not insurmountable, and it's a question we need to ask. How do we manage our coexistence in shared space? Often, we just start by specifying who doesn't belong. We have hostile and defensive architecture. Those of you from Seattle will know the picture at the bottom left. Does anybody know that picture? How cynical to use sustainability infrastructure, bike racks, to oust homeless people. And I was pleased to see that the Seattle biking community came out in outrage that the city would be using bike racks to stop homeless people sleeping. But we're using defensive architecture, hostile architecture. We have rich doors and poor doors. We have spikes to stop homeless people lying down. We have benches with armrests, not for our comfort, but to stop homeless people sleeping there. We have studs on walls to stop those teenage kids doing their crazy skateboarding tricks. We specify who doesn't belong. Or we physically separate our cities. Sometimes not as extreme as this with the walls, but we impose what I call spatial injustice. We separate our cities, and we know that. Let me try a little experiment. Who grew up in a city where there was a railway line, a creek, or some other, maybe a freeway, and on one side of that freeway, creek, or railway, they lived, and on this other side, you lived? Hands up, who grew up? Look at this. We live in divided cities. How do we heal that spatial injustice? The spatial injustice of growing up on one side where things are good, schools are good, opportunities are good, and your life is probably 20 years longer than on the other side of the tracks. Sometimes, though, we also fail to engage diverse audiences. There's a great quote here from a really interesting report that was done in Boston in the early 2000s. And it was immigrant engagement in public open space, strategies for the new Boston. And any of these reports that I'm mentioning, if anybody wants them, I can send you a PDF. But what's really interesting is this quote: the lack of engagement of more recent immigrants in Friends of the Park organizations and other environmental groups of today has led to concerns that while Olmsted's vision continues to resonate with a great many Bostonians, it may not resonate with the majority of those who will decide Boston's future. The point here is, if your organization doesn't look like the people it is serving, are you legitimate? Do you have traction and credibility if you don't look like the communities you serve? I'll give you one example of an organization that really has got great traction, and it's called the Dudley Square Neighborhood Initiative in Boston. They did a demographic analysis of the local community, and their board of directors matches that demographic analysis. People can see themselves in that organization, and they can believe that they belong. So again, this idea of belonging, I think, is really important. But let me move away from belonging. I think you get the picture. It doesn't have to be this way, because what we are excited about, one of the things we're excited about, is that urban policy, planning, environmentalism is about what we can become. We're reimagining streets in big cities. You all know where this is. This is in New York. Never in my life would I believe I would see pictures like this. The woman in the red suit there, sitting there in a deck chair as if it's the most normal thing in the world to be sitting in the middle of the street. The young woman blissed out on the moment of transgression where we reclaimed the streets. People sitting outside Macy's on Broadway. Macy's is now a people's street. We are reclaiming streets. But it doesn't just happen by accident. This was Mayor Bloomberg, who hired an inspirational transportation commissioner, Janet Siddiq Khan, who brought in one of the world's most celebrated urbanists, Jan Gehl from Copenhagen, who brought in the great civil society groups who wanted to get the job done in New York and to make streets for people. This was a coalition that made things work. And you, in part, at Washington Environment Council, are a coalition who wants to get things done. We can, and we are reimagining streets. We can, and we are reimagining the way environmentalism and environmental policy can be. Because, as the governor said, we're not going to get any help from the federal government. This is our fight. We're reimagining streets in smaller cities. Even if I didn't put the locations of those streets, you would be able to tell me, I think, which one is in the United States and which one is in Sweden. So, what's really interesting about this, these two streets, Massachusetts Avenue and Södervägen, are identical width. But one street has a principle of rights to public space that is based on the size of your vehicle. I'll let you guess which one that is. In our streets, it's about your vehicle and the size of your vehicle. That gives you rights to space. But what the Swedes have done is they've democratized the street. They have imposed spatial justice on the street. If you look to the left of that streetcar, there is a very narrow section of the street that is for private vehicles. That's all. Everybody else is cycling, walking, or in the streetcars. Now, think about those two streets. And think about the kid growing up on those streets. The kid growing up on Södervägen in Gothenburg versus the kid growing up on Massachusetts Avenue. What about the wiring of their brain? Every morning you're coming out and you're seeing, might is right, or you're seeing a democratized street where pedestrians, cyclists, transit users have equal rights or more rights to public space than do vehicle users. That's a really important thing, a really important point. So we're reimagining streets in smaller cities. We're rethinking urban parks. This book, and I don't usually advertise other people's books, I tell you, but this book is worth a read. If you're interested in urban parks, Rethinking Urban Parks, Public Space and Cultural Diversity. Public space, not public space and biodiversity, or parks and biodiversity, but public space and cultural diversity. The main argument of this book is that we are designing public spaces that exclude some people through social and cultural means. We're not providing public spaces which have or are inviting for everyone. Now, we have bundles of data to know how to design public spaces in ways that are engaging. What this book really reminds us is that our public spaces are not just passive spaces, they're places of potential encounter and engagement. We live in a diverse world. Our public spaces are places where we have contact with difference. And there is an idea called contact theory, and that says, quite simply, the more contact we have with people who are different to us, the more sympathetic and even accepting and welcoming of diversity and difference we are. How do you do that? How do we, as urban planners, as environmentalists, how do we create spaces of encounter, spaces of positive engagement? Because we're self-sorting as a nation. We need to create these spaces, spaces that have meaning and spaces that foster positive encounter. Copenhagen, always ahead of the game. There is a district of Copenhagen called Nørrebro. It's a very diverse immigrant district, and there is a park called Superkilen Park in Nørrebro, where the city planners said, you know, what can we make of this public space? It's a linear park, as you can see. What can we make of this space? So they came up with a brilliant idea. They asked the community, what do you want in the park? And yeah, I know it's one of these revolutionary ideas, isn't it? But the community said, we're from many different nations. Can you get artifacts from our nations and put them in these parks? So you have things from Russia, from Ghana, from Mexico, Spain, all over the world. Every community is represented in this park. Now, is that going to stop racism? Is it going to increase social justice? Maybe not, but it shows presence. It shows that your community is represented in this space. And these artifacts are a point of discussion between different members of the community. Can we do that? Of course we can do that. Let's create these spaces that have meaning to multiple groups. Too often, we design defensive spaces, not inclusive spaces. I want to see more inclusive spaces. Now, let me introduce you to George and Julia Bowling, because George and Julia Bowling are a couple of tobacco farmers from Maryland. State of Maryland for the last 20 years has tried to get tobacco farmers to grow something else. So the new sign to their farm is to the left of them, and it says African produce. George and Julia, being good American entrepreneurs and farmers, have realized that there's 140,000 African migrants, new Americans, living in the Washington, D.C. area. And you know what? They want to eat African food. But they don't want frozen food. They don't want it shipped in. They want it grown on their farm in Maryland. So George and Julia have got a great business working with the African community, finding what will grow in the subtropical sort of Maryland area that they live in. Here, subtropical, sort of, you know, hey. Close enough. But the point I'm making here is, what is local food in an intercultural society? We have this label of local. What does that mean when the Africans want to eat African food that is grown locally? The Filipinos in San Diego want to eat Filipino food that is grown locally. The Chinese Canadian farmers, who make up 15% of the farmers in the Greater Vancouver region, are eating Chinese food and growing African food as well, incidentally. So what is local food? We use this word local rather exclusively because we think of local as kind of the Euro type foods that we want. No, a lot of these new immigrants are starting to redefine local in a trans-local kind of way. So I think local foods should be what people want to eat as local rather than what we as ecologists might define as local. And my final sort of thoughts, and here is a book advert for one of my books, Sharing Cities, A Case for Truly Smart and Sustainable Cities. We are rediscovering sharing. One of the basic human traits before competition came in was sharing. We wouldn't have got off the plains and savannas of East Africa if we didn't share in the kill and the spoils of hunting. It wasn't about competition, it was about cooperation, togetherness and sharing. It's an ancient human trait. A lot of us are members of mutual societies, of libraries, of organizations based on the very human concept of sharing. And I think rediscovering this, not Uber or Airbnb, but cities that are looking at shared responsibilities, shared resources, like the urban commons. Now, yes, we can use economic and markets-based ways of sharing. So Uber and Airbnb are those. But cities are playing catch-up. Cities are not on the front in terms of these organizations. I wish some cities were more up with and developing policy alongside some of these more recent developments. But what we cannot get away from is that commercial approaches to sharing are only one aspect of sharing. Cultural approaches, political approaches, co-creation of the urban commons, I think, is something that we're thinking about a lot more. Now, organizations like Washington Environment Council, you're thinking about the state commons in a sense. A lot of my work focuses on the urban commons. It's a really, I think, exciting moment to be involved in this kind of work, where more and more cities around the world, from Seoul to Copenhagen, Amsterdam, San Francisco, a lot of cities are thinking about how can we develop the sharing economy and sharing concepts to develop a much greater urban commons. So I think go out, co-create Washington's future for the next 7 generations. And you're already starting to do this through your strategic plans, driving transformation through partnerships, pursuing racial and environmental justice, focusing on and fostering innovation and partnering with the Washington Conservation Volunteers. I'm really happy to be able to be here, to see such a lively audience, both here and earlier on today. I think you can co-create a wonderful sharing Washington state. Now get your checkbooks out and let's do this. Thank you.